Joining us right now on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline, Yahoo Sports, Eric Edholm covers the NFL draft to get into what his takeaways were from the draft. Check out his full draft recap over at Yahoo Sports. Eric, how you doing today?
I'm all right. I took a little mental health day today, which I think helped me after a long, grinding draft season. But, yeah, it was an interesting one for sure.
It was definitely interesting. And before we get into any specific players or picks, I felt that one of the biggest things I personally took away from the draft is it felt like teams went into this draft, like the Eagles, for example, with a specific strategy. Like the Eagles felt like they were going like best player available, or a team like the Cowboys who were saying, if we don't go defense, we are DOA. So it felt like teams had a hyper-focused position when it came to this draft.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to say it. I mean, obviously, you had some teams who were kind of on the fence a little bit about quarterback or no quarterback. And that was an interesting one to see. Atlanta could have taken one. They went Kyle Pitts. You could have certainly seen Carolina at 8, Denver at 9. Minnesota was in a position to draft Justin Fields if they wanted to. They kind of made a half-hearted effort to move up. And, there were some that I think felt like, all right, we're going to stay the course with our quarterback. And that was sort of a big theme that allowed, Fields and Mac Jones to get out of the top 10. But I think you're right. I think there were some real specific sort of need hunting teams out there and teams that were bent on getting some 2022 capital, and making sure that was a part of any return on their trade or something like that. So, yeah, I did feel like there were some carved out avenues for certain clubs.
Now, with the Eagles, I think a lot of people, at least in this area, were a little bit surprised, excited. They traded up for Devonta Smith. But then the second round, they get another Alabama player that's got some questions. I do find it interesting that 2 straight picks, 2 straight Alabama players, something the Eagles haven't done pretty much ever. They don't really go Alabama that often.
Freddie Millen's last one, I believe, before this draft. And I think before that, there hadn't been one since the mid-'90s. So it's kind of crazy when you think about that. Like the Carolina Panthers had never drafted a Clemson player before. It was just sort of those weird quirks that come up. But the Ravens had never drafted an LSU player before Patrick Queen last year. But, yeah, no, I mean, just the players themselves, I think the fit is tremendous. I mean, I really think Devonta Smith's going to step in and be, active and a big participant in the passing game. He might help open up things for Jalen Reagor even and the rest of the receiving corps. So, Landon Dickerson clearly is the wild card because of that injury factor. I think he would have been a top 20 pick had he not had basically 4 season-ending injuries or 4 of the last 5 years end with injuries. So, that's the hard part is the player is the type of guy who 32 offensive line coaches bang the table for and say, I want this guy. He can play guard, he can play center. He's got great size. He moves well. He's extremely tough, very smart, natural-born leader. He's worked with some great quarterbacks in Alabama. And, it's hard not to think that what he could have been without the injuries and what he still is now. So fascinating to see where he is health-wise. Obviously, that's it'll put him on track to get back by training camp. But how much can he do at that point? We don't know.
The Eagles didn't get a cornerback, Eric, until McPherson in the 4th round. Are you surprised it took them that long to get a corner? And what is your evaluation of Zack McPherson?
Right, Zack. You got to say it that way. That's the unusual first name there. Well, he was somebody who couldn't get on the field at Penn State. I mean, that was a talented player they had sort of high hopes for. He's not super big, doesn't really have great length, but I think he's a pretty good little player. I mean, I thought he really kind of showed last season. He had the 4 interceptions last year in a shortened season. He had I think 3 or 4 block kicks in his career. And he had a couple of touchdowns last year. One was, I think, off a block kick, and one was off either a fumble return or something like that. I've been trying to remember exactly what, but I watched him a little, and he kind of caught my eye. He's a very feisty, instinctive player, and I think he's somebody that flew beneath the radar throughout, much of the college season, and then really a good portion of draft season too. He was sort of seen as a late riser, at least in terms of media exposure and, fan attention and things like that. So, yeah, ideally, in a perfect world, they could have had J.C. Horn come to them or something like that. It just wasn't in the cards. It wasn't going to happen because those two teams up in the top 10, so they wanted corners. They went out and got them before the Cowboys picked. So I think they just sort of pivoted, and that's what you have to do in the draft. I mean, best laid plans and all that. You can come in and somebody takes your favorite player sooner than your pick. All right, we're already on to plan B, and we may have to pivot to plan C. So that unfortunately pushed cornerback down. I don't think they felt like they could pass Dickerson at that point, knowing that Brandon Brooks is coming off an injury and Jason Kelsey's, sort of in the twilight a little bit. And, this is a guy who could play both spots. He could play tackle if you needed him to. And that's why they ultimately had to wait at the position. But McPherson's very interesting. I think he's somebody to keep an eye on for sure.
Eric Edholm, Yahoo Sports, joining us here on the Boardwalk Kind of Hotline here on Game Night on 97.3 ESPN at Eric_Edholm on Twitter. Eric, the guy who I think for the Eagles could be the steal of this draft might be Kenneth Gainwell. Tell the folks out there about Kenneth Gainwell from Memphis.
Yeah, he's a really interesting player. And, I mean, the opt-out season seemed to have kind of hurt him a little bit. I mean, they, kept kind of facing questions about, what the effect was going to be. And, for top players like Micah Parsons and Penei Sewell, didn't really have much of an effect. Those guys were always going to go high. But, for Gainwell to go where he did, I want to say, around the 150th pick or something. That was about 2 rounds lower than I thought he would go. This is probably the best third down back, or one of the best third down backs in this entire class. Not a big guy, kind of a bigger Boston Scott a little bit. I mean, I don't know. That was one way somebody described him the other day. But he's kind of got a squirting running style, but he's also tough. He'll take a hit and kind of keep powering through it a little bit. So good sort of contact balance a little bit. Not big. I don't know how much of a volume guy he's going to be, but I absolutely think that, he and Miles Sanders have a way to kind of pair up, and it can take some of the workload off of his shoulders a little bit. We know injuries are a little bit of a story for him as well. So I thought it was absurd value at that point and did a great job. I thought he all day long should have been a top 100 player. So, again, that's one of the reasons why I like the Eagles draft. Is they kind of let the draft come to them in a certain respect and weren't afraid to take players that had fallen out of their expected range. So that was one of my favorites for them for sure.
I want to ask you about another player that interested me personally because I got to see him some last year. Taron Jackson is an interesting guy to me because he was part of that Coastal Carolina defense that was famous or infamous, depending on who you ask. And he was one of those guys who was, chasing after Zach Wilson in that big showdown between Carolina and BYU. So tell the folks about that what you think Taron Jackson could be at the NFL level.
Yeah, he's tough to project, but he's easy to. He's the kind of guy that you love him if he's on your team, you hate him if he's on the other team, right? He got some penalties. He sort of plays through the whistle. He's got like a little bit of a kind of a Hugh Douglas type chip on his shoulder. I mean, I'm not saying he's going to be as good as Hugh Douglas. I'm just saying if you're looking for sort of a style comp, that's him. He's a highly aggressive player, made a ton of plays in the backfield. That Coastal Carolina defense had, 3 or 4 really good talents on it. So he was kind of the leader of the group a little bit. And I saw him early in the year against Kansas. He was in the backfield all night. I don't think he had any sacks, but I just remember him kind of living in the backfield and pressuring and, making his impact felt. And then of course the big game against BYU against Zach Wilson, had a big hit on Wilson and, sort of made his presence felt a little bit, like standing over him a little. And he's got a chip on his shoulder. He's an undersized rusher, but he's got really powerful hands. Like he'll shock you and kind of knock guys back. He's got a feisty play temperament. He's got some instincts there. I think a lot of people felt like day 3 was where he was going to end up going, but it's a guy to watch, and I'll be fascinated to hear the training camp reports of how he's doing in one-on-one battles and things like that. But yeah, he's an aggressive player for sure.
The last player I want to ask you about specifically with the Eagles is Jacoby Stevens, safety at LSU, but the Eagles are talking about making him into a linebacker, which is interesting because you have this, Jonathan Gannon comes from Indianapolis and Minnesota, so they value their linebackers, but you're asking a guy who played safety now to maybe be a little different in the NFL.
Yeah, I mean, he was up in the box a lot. He was obviously somebody who could, support in the run game and made some plays in coverage too, and not a giant guy. We're not talking about a 230-pound safety. He was more in the 210, 215 range, but that was the spot that I think as the NFL kind of takes linebackers off the field or puts more speed and emphasis on that at that position. We see more, 4-2-5 alignments in the NFL, obviously. He certainly fits the bill of kind of that, that nickel or dime safety / linebacker hybrid guy who can, if you need him to cover the slot, he can do that. Absolutely. He played through some injuries this year and was a tough player. I mean, people down at LSU really kind of appreciate the effort he gave this year, started 10 games and, things weren't going great, right? They lose their opener at home to Mississippi State. It was an embarrassment. They gave up a ton of points. They kept kind of getting better throughout the course of the season, those who stuck around, and he was kind of one of the leaders. So quietly had a real nice season, got a little lost in the draft picture, but yeah, I mean, he's definitely not going to be one of those stack and shed linebackers, that you're sort of used to seeing, but he can play up around the line of scrimmage, has good athleticism for that size. So yeah, he's a pretty instinctive ball player. I think he's a nice guy who, will come and rattle some cages a little bit and hit a little and, can run pretty well for a guy that size.
Yahoo Sports' Eric Edholm joining us here on Game Night on 97.3 ESPN. Check out his full NFL draft grades over at Yahoo Sports, at Eric_Edholm on Twitter. Eric, I want to ask you about the other teams in the NFC. Start with the Giants. I thought the Giants had the best trade, which is they traded down with the Bears and got a first-round pick for next year. I thought they got good value for Azeez Ojulari and Aaron Robinson, but overall, I got to say I wasn't blown away by their draft, but I thought it was a serviceable draft.
Yeah, trading down twice. Dave Gettleman was asked before the draft. He'd never done it before. Like, are you ever going to trade down? It was almost like he was sort of sticking it to the media or having a little fun with it anyway. But, yeah, getting the pick next year from the Bears is obviously the big coup, and they're clearly hoping that Justin Fields would struggle as a rookie if he got in there in Chicago. So, yeah, I mean, I think they wanted J.C. Horn too. I think the Eagles and Giants both were in on Horn, and when he went number 8, that sort of forced both teams into a little bit of retreat mode and sort of restacking the deck. And, the Eagles obviously vault up over them, and I think they clearly felt like Devontae Smith was their second option behind Horn, or that he may have been their first for that matter. So it was interesting to see them pivot and go with Kadarius Toney. I had mocked Toney at number 20 to the Bears probably about a month ago. And, talking to some people around the league, there were some teams that put second-round grades on him, and some people felt like they wouldn't take him in the top 20. They didn't think that he was a refined enough receiver. He was more of a gadget guy and hand it to him on reverses and, short bubble screens, use him on returns, that sort of thing. But he's electric. I mean, it's going to take him a couple years to figure it all out, I think. The former high school quarterback who's still relatively new to the position, missed some time with injury in 2019. So, I was having a hard time figuring out exactly what his value should be. I ended up giving him a second-round grade. So didn't necessarily love the pick, but like you said, when you get a trade value that good, I think it makes a lot of sense. And they added, obviously, a lot of talent, Kenny Golladay and everybody else. So you're right. Ojulari is my favorite pick. Aaron Robinson was probably my second favorite pick. They got Greedy Williams' brother, Rodarius, late in the draft. This kid, Ellerson Smith from UNI, is pretty good. I mean, overall, it was, I think, a solid crop. I think they'll get 3 players out of this class.
The Cowboys, I believe, drafted 8 defensive players in the draft over 3 days. And listen, I love the Parsons pick. It just makes so much sense for what they need. Kelvin Joseph, I'm a little lukewarm about. The pick I really like is Jabril Cox. I think that guy has a chance to be an impact player. Maybe not like a superstar or anything like that, but I'm like just an impact starting linebacker for 8 years. He's that kind of solid type of dude. I think that makes sense for what the Cowboys need.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I had a top 60 grade on Jabril Cox. He was my number 52, 3, 4. I don't remember, somewhere in that range. So to see him go in the, 120th pick or whatever it was, that was stunning to me. They took a corner before that, Nashawn Wright, who I thought was, boy, like a 6th, 7th round pick. They took him but right before Cox, their choice before him, and that shocked me a little bit. They ended up doubling back with Israel Mukuamu, another big corner who I guess could play safety too. So people have suggested that's a possible home for him. But yeah, it was like carpet bombing. They just, they missed out on the top 2 corners. I know we've now done that ad nauseum here, but I definitely feel like they were headed that direction and just said, all right, we like Micah Parsons. Great. We'll use him as an attacking linebacker, and Jabril Cox is going to be our coverage guy. So what does that say about Leighton Vander Esch and Jalen Smith? Those guys were 1st and 2nd round picks. And, for teams that may only play 2 linebackers the majority of the time, that sends a message that maybe they're a little bit concerned about those guys long term. They weren't very, either healthy or good last year in the case of Smith. So, yeah, kind of a confusing draft, but I understand their thinking is let's just unload the chamber and let's get as many defensive players in here to help one of the worst units in the NFL last year.
The final team in the NFC East is the one that confused me the most, Eric. Eric Edholm, Yahoo Sports, joining us here on the Boardwalk on the Hotline here on Game Night on 97.3 ESPN. Jamin Davis, I know people liked him, but the 19th pick felt really, really rich for me. Benjamin St-Juste he's solid. De'Ami Brown's a nice player, but it just felt like they were just kind of like throwing darts and almost seeing what landed after a while.
Yeah, I didn't love their overall draft, but the more I looked at it, the more I thought it's not terrible, right? And they got maybe some late round values too. I think your questions are fair because, Davis probably would have gone in the next 10 to 15 picks after that. I can't say exactly where, but I know at least one team that probably would have had a discussion about him in the late first round. So, I think they just sort of felt like Ron Rivera saw something in this kid. I think they would have taken Zaven Collins had he not gone off the board 3 picks earlier. This is me speculating a little bit. I haven't gotten that from the Washington football team or anything, but putting some dots together, they were a team that was very, very interested in Collins from what I could tell. So I don't know if he was their second choice there or if they really didn't like anybody else at that point. That's an interesting question to kind of pose. But yeah, Sam Cosmi is an okay tackle. I had him ranked right about where they took him. I had St-Juste a little lower than they took him. I think I had him just outside my top 100. He's a long corner with some promise. It's hard to say exactly what he's going to be right now. They drafted a long snapper, but no quarterback. That's always, fair to criticize, I think. But De'Ami Brown could be pretty good. They've done a good job of assembling some interesting weapons the last few years. McLaurin and Gibson and obviously, Logan Thomas has, come out of nowhere. So I think Brown will add a nice deep element to that game. He's got to diversify a little bit, but he's a good player. So yeah, it was an okay lot. I didn't love it. I didn't hate it.
Follow me on Twitter at Eric_Edholm. The full final 2021 NFL draft grades. It's over at Yahoo Sports for the full rundown from Eric Edholm from every NFL team right there. Sports.yahoo.com. Eric Edholm had him on the Boardwalk on the Hotline. Eric, appreciate the time today.
All right, buddy. See ya.
Josh Hennig here on Game Night on 97.3 ESPN. Great stuff from Eric as always.